gentlemen, welcome. My name is Ian Whittaker. I'm the Assistant Director for Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and we're delighted to welcome Hagar Chemaly, Jesse Holcomb, Sarah Kendzior, and Peter Slevin to the Council this evening. A few quick housekeeping points. We're on the record, we're live streaming, and we welcome social media, but please silence your phones before we begin. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, non-partisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. The Council organises over 200 events per year. Looking ahead to the coming weeks, some highlights include January 25th, we'll discuss the future of trade. That's a panel with Gary Huffbauer of the Peterson Institute, Thea Lee of the AFL-CIO, Phil Levy of the Chicago Council, and moderated by Sean Donnan of the Financial Times. On January 26th, we'll ask, is this the Asian century? There'll be a panel with Michael Oslin of the American Enterprise Institute, Carl Friedoff of the Chicago Council, Deborah Lair of the Paulson Institute, and it'll be moderated by Phil Levy of the Chicago Council. And then on February 23rd, looking a little bit further ahead, we'll look at the future of work. It's going to be a panel with Rick Wartzman of the Drucker Institute and Amy Webb of the Future Trends Institute and others, TBD. Turning back to this evening's program, I look forward to discussion on fake news and post-truth politics. What do these terms mean, and what do they tell us about the changing relationship between our media, society, and democracy? We have an expert panel to explore these issues this evening. Very briefly, from left to right, Peter Slevin is an associate professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. He's a former correspondent at the Miami Herald and Washington Post, where he covered foreign and security issues, U.S. politics, and extensively covered Barack and Michelle Obama. Sarah Kendzior is a St. Louis-based writer and columnist for the Globe and Mail. She is the author of The View from Flyover Country, a collection of her essays which is available on Kindle. She's also a prominent blogger and social media commentator on political and social issues with an astounding 148,000 Twitter followers. Jesse Holcomb is an associate director of research at the Pew Research Center. He's the author of numerous studies and reports on the changing news ecosystem, the use of social media in journalism, and fake news. And Hagar Chemaly is the founder and CEO of PR firm Greenwich Media Strategies. She's the former director of communications for the United States Mission to the United Nations and a former spokesperson on terrorism and financial intelligence at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. And our moderator today is Noah Tolley. He is the senior fellow for global cities at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and he's a professor of urban studies, politics, and international relations at Wheaton College. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, and thanks to our panelists. I'd like to open with a question for all of our panelists. In the run-up to, and especially in the aftermath of the 2016 presidential election, anxiety about the news and commentary that we consume has been running very high. In his farewell speech given here in Chicago just last week, President Obama said that we've become so secure in our bubbles that we start accepting information, whether it's true or not, that fits our opinions, instead of basing our opinions on the evidence that's out there. We've seen a new crop of terms emerge for this challenge, including post-truth, post-fact, talk of fake news, which are used to describe changes in the production, dissemination, consumption, and interpretation of information. What do these terms even mean? And are the challenges and practices they describe really new? Let's start there. Peter, maybe you can kick it off.
I would say that post-truth is the idea that each person is entitled to her own set of facts, or that it's all kind of relative. We can believe what we choose to believe. We've gone a long way from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, you're entitled to your own opinions, but certainly not your own set of facts. I would say fake news is something that is deliberately false, that is put out as under the guise of being a true and accurate story, but can't even pretend to be actual news.
Good. Thank you.
I'll jump on to Peter's comment. I think I agree with him on those definitions. One of the things that we're learning in the post-truth era is this practice of relying on information that somebody wants to believe, so something that's appealing to them on an emotional basis, in order to make any kind of judgment or decision. And fake news one of the things I think that's so important to discern is, at least this is my view, is that it's not bad journalism or slanted journalism or even propaganda. It's specifically fabricated news that is entirely made up to achieve whatever goal it might be, whether it's for greater clicks or additional profit or to achieve a political or ideological goal.
I think that's right, and it's important probably to not go too far into this conversation without acknowledging that the terminology around fake news it's been politicized. Its meaning has probably seen some degree of decay. My sense, at least, is that originally, when it started to percolate in media critic and media watchdog circles, was that it did have a very specific kind of connotation to it. Made up stories that were presented as fact. And so perhaps the term itself has lost some of its usefulness as it's been reappropriated in different contexts, and its meaning has probably been expanded to refer to other kinds of propaganda, other kinds of misinformation, but really it's something that's pretty specific. But one thing that most Americans, and this is what our research has found in the past year, most Americans have this kind of nagging sense that the information commons, whether it's due to fake news or something else, has begun to further erode. We found during the course of the campaign that it was 81% of the electorate felt that Trump supporters, Clinton supporters, not only didn't agree on a common set of policies or recommendations, but could not even agree on the basic facts. So that's where we are.
Yeah, I agree about the politicization of the term fake news. It first started cropping up in November after the election. It was used mostly by mainstream outlets to refer to the kind of completely fabricated stories put out by Russian or Macedonian propagandists or, Trump's own team as an effort to sway the election. One thing I didn't like about the term is that it came to describe all different types of disinformation, propaganda, sloppy reporting, fabricated stories, and then became slapped onto the end of any story that somebody didn't like as a way to precondition the audience to dismiss it. And so, I think the term at this point, people kind of realize that's happening, is kind of outworn its welcome. And I think the same is kind of true of post-truth, post-fact. I don't think we're in a post-fact world, because if we were in a post-fact world, then the Trump administration and his team would not try so hard to repress the facts. They would not go so hard after journalists who are investigating the more unsavory aspects of his administration. And so I think the idea of a fact still matters very much. It's just that it needs to be Trump's facts. It needs to be one set of facts. And one way to kind of dissuade people from pursuing facts is to kind of throw the whole thing out the window and say, oh, well, none of these people are trustworthy anyway. And so there's multiple ways of manipulating the public, I think, happening at once.
It's probably worth saying, too, that one person who has used fake news as an epithet is the president-elect. He had his first press conference in 6 months, and a CNN reporter, Jim Acosta, got up and asked him a question. He refused to answer the question. You probably all saw that. He said he didn't want that CNN to ask any questions, and then he finally said, "You are fake news." Now, for the record, and I think it is important to recognize, how the term has been kind of bastardized. CNN actually was not responsible for fake news in this report. In fact, they reported exactly what had happened, that the President of the United States and the President-elect had, in fact, been briefed on a dossier. They did not publish the dossier. They didn't pretend that the dossier was true or false. They didn't take a stand on it. They simply reported it, what actually turned out to be what is sometimes known as a fact. And so, yes, remarkable. Fake news, in the words of the man who tomorrow will be the 45th President of the United States. So media, many members of the media are recognizing what they're up against.
A couple interesting points I want to follow up on there. One was Sarah's point that the terms themselves can be used in order to dismiss certain kinds of facts. So yes, they describe a reality that we want to explore, critique, learn how to live better with or get rid of. But on the other hand, the story that we just heard from Peter, the comments that you made, suggest that calling something fake news or saying that we live in a post-fact or post-truth world can just be used to dismiss the facts you don't like. And I wonder what you think might be better ways to describe the phenomena that we're dealing with, ways that can't be necessarily twisted or aren't twisted yet to do that work.
I think we need to look at the intent of the story. You know, sometimes there are stories that come out where journalists just make errors along the way. This happens in reporting all the time. It's not with malicious intent. It's not meant to boost a political goal. It's just something that happens. And that's very distinct from political propaganda, things just put out by a campaign, by things that are, you know, disprovable, like when Trump says he didn't say something and then we can watch a video of him saying it, and you know that clearly is a lie. I think we should be a little more comfortable using the term lie for something that's so clear cut. There's been some resistance in the thank you. There's been some resistance in the news media. You know, several outlets are kind of cringing and, you know, want to work around that, but a lie is a lie. And, you know, with Trump, he's a talkative guy. He's a prolific tweeter. He's left a vast record of statements and actions that we could all examine thoroughly to see if they match up with what we know as reality. And so I think, you know, we need to be aggressive about tracking that. I think we need to look at the long term and dig deep. It's a tough situation when you have a president who's, you know, doesn't advocate for transparency and also lies frequently. But it's our job as journalists to pursue it nonetheless.
To answer,
Maybe we'll jump in on that?
yes,
Yeah.
to answer your question, I am not entirely sure that it matters what kind of a better term we might come up with to describe this kind of information that would indicate that it's somehow illegitimate. I would imagine that were such a term, a better term introduced, it would in a short period of time be used to turn back on the national institutional media that a large share of Americans, for a variety of different reasons, feel this deep-seated mistrust toward. So, you know, I know scholars and certain journalists are really trying to work very hard. You know, you think of the Brian Stelters of the world. We're trying to be very clear about what we're talking about and be precise. But when you have a president-elect who says you are fake news, he's channeling something that is resonant for a large share of the American public.
And to be fair, in terms of the question of using the terms, fake news has existed for a very long time. It's just that it entered our politics and our election very recently, and it has affected us on a whole other level. But when you think of, for example, celebrity tabloids, right? Those have existed for years, and a lot of them are completely fabricated fake news. And some celebrities take action against that because it's, you know, libel or defamation, and some of them don't. You know, it's brushed under the rug. Other countries are very, you know, fake news is often a way of life in a lot of other countries, like China, Russia, a lot of countries in the Middle East, where certain media outlets are either censored by the government or they're state-owned, and so they'll create fake news to support their own movements, to omit information, to deny information, or, you know, to achieve their political agenda. So in terms of whether or not to use the terms or how that might affect, I would agree that we're a bit past that now. They're out there, it is what it is. It's more the question of that it's entered our daily political life, and, you know, are we equipped, is the media equipped to handle it? Is the public equipped to handle it?
Right. I want to go back to a comment that Jesse made about 81%, is that the number, of the respondents to your survey could not agree on what the facts were.
Or rather, felt that voters of various camps could not agree on the facts.
Okay.
Presumably, they would themselves, on some level, be included in that, but yes.
Okay, and so I want to come back later to why that is and what that means about how we're consuming media. But for now, I want to talk a bit about some of the effects of that. It seems to me, the term information commons was used earlier. This seems to erode the sense of any information commons at all, or reflect the erosion of any sense of information commons. It also seems to me it may erode a bit the pursuit of the common good. Can you talk a little bit about what the effects are here? I'm seeing both of those things. What are the other effects of this mistrust, not agreeing on the same sources or types of information or facts? What are we seeing out there? Sarah, I can see.
Yeah, sure,
Sarah.
I'll talk about
Okay.
that. I feel like you can't really separate that question from what's happened to the media over the past 15 years, both in terms of the rise of digital media, but also what's happened geographically, where you now have 1 out of 4 journalists living in 3 extremely expensive coastal cities. You have a gutting of local media all across the country, but especially in the center of the country. And the national outlets are, reporting from places that don't necessarily have much in common with the way, people are living. There's some truth in that. I think that Trump exploited that, as a campaign strategy. There's, fairly smart thing to do, incredibly damaging, but he was aware of that. But I think it's the erosion of social trust and distrust in institutions goes hand in hand with that. We've had a lot of institutions weakened, especially since the recession. We've had a lot of gutting of the civic good, and media is just one casualty. And so I think in order to build that back up, if that's possible, we need to start rebuilding local news outlets. We need to have a broader representation of journalists from all around the country. Because I think that if you live in the same place, of course people disagree, of course people argue about what's there, not about what's there, but about what they think about things, what they think is right or wrong about an event. But they're not gonna say it didn't happen, because they were there, they can see it with their own eyes, they know people, they often know their local reporters, and so that's one step to kind of get people to trust the media again, because I don't blame them for not trusting the media. I often don't trust the media myself, and I'm in the media. I spend a lot of time calling out things that are just factually inaccurate, but also things that stereotype or don't get to the heart of what people's problems are. And so, above all, I think journalism is a public service. I think it's in the good of the country to restore these local institutions and to try to pursue the topics that, if exposed more thoroughly, could perhaps improve people's lives.
I think we're also at a very interesting period in the news business, not only for the many reasons Sarah talks about, and you only have to live in Chicago and see what's happened to local media over recent years. Money is a big factor, for sure. Lack of space, lack of time, too many reporters trying to do too many things going uncovered. But I do think that there's a post-November 8th sensibility. I see it in my students at Northwestern. I see it in young reporters especially. And I see it among my former colleagues at the Washington Post. There is a sense of mission, not to put too fine a point on it. Some of you will remember Watergate and Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers, and the fact that generated a powerful stream or strain of investigative reporting, and a sense that the media had to be there, reporters had to be there for the civic good, that for all the reasons that in fact Barack Obama has been discussing on his way out the door. I don't see why that might not happen again. I think it's interesting that the Pew survey of trust in the media reached its high point in 1976. Now it has fallen significantly, obviously, as we know, to a new low in September of, what is it now, about 24%?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're thinking of the Gallup. The trend of doom.
Right. So it has fallen, trust has fallen. Although interestingly enough, the Gallup poll does point out actually that Democrats still about 50% trust the media. But more broadly, I think there are an awful lot of people in the media who are hearing a bit of a call to arms. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, Sarah's point about local media and the game of coastal concentration, which I think is a neat term that Josh Benton coined. It's important. I mean, yes, we have seen the gutting of these newsrooms. Something like 39% of newsroom jobs have disappeared into thin air over the last 20 years, largely driven by these concurrent crises in technological transformation and the implosion of the business model. You see this on the local level, and why it's important one of the reasons why it's important, given everything that's happening in Washington, is that so much of civic life happens right outside our front doors and in our communities. And our research just from this past fall has found it's more evidence indicating that there is this kind of virtuous cycle between civic engagement, community engagement, and engagement with local community news. So local newsrooms, the weaker they are, the more pressed they are, the smaller their newsrooms are, in some ways hamstrings their ability perhaps to innovate, perhaps to cover those stories that the budgets of yesteryear would have allowed them to cover. And there's a relationship there between the health of civic life, between social capital, and the health of those local newsrooms. So I think that it's important, even with all of our attention being focused on Washington today, tomorrow, in the coming years, that we not forget to think about what's happening in all of those cities that have been affected by this game of coastal concentration.
We've begun to segue already into how did we get here? That was one of the sets of questions I would hope to tackle tonight. So what are the dynamics that led to this moment? These are the questions that I was pondering earlier today. How did the conditions for the possibility of fake news and post-truth even develop, and how did we become so susceptible to it? And a lot of what we just talked about had to do with media, local media, national media moving to very polarized areas of the country, geographically, if not also politically polarized. The gutting of institutions beginning with the recession and perhaps even before. I want to ask about the business model of tech companies too, though. So media comes up a lot, but we also have to tackle the question of the business model of companies like Twitter, Facebook, social media networks that have somehow elevated and spread or served as a platform for the spread of fictitious stories, among other things, right? Also candidate tweets that they're not accountable for. So what does that business model do to this environment?
Well, can I jump in?
Yeah.
Before the proliferation of the internet and social media, there were numerous steps that had to be taken, right? Editors and so on and so forth, or at least for tweeting from a candidate, there were comms directors and there were filters that were created to prevent to ascertain what was being said, to verify it, to ensure there were no other, there were no unintended consequences, and that to also to verify that what was being written or stated was factually accurate. And the proliferation of the internet and social media has taken that away, because now anybody can have a YouTube channel, can create a website and create fake stories, as we saw in the New York Times piece today on this 23-year-old individual who just created a news site because he wanted to make some money, and it worked. And so this lack of a filter is a business model that has worked for these tech companies, because it's allowed all these users to go on to get instant gratification, to use it for perhaps different purposes, many of the time publicity-related purposes, but it's also created this room and space for people to abuse that. And I think, it poses a great challenge for tech companies to, a great challenge and also a great opportunity for them to figure out how they can partner with institutions like PolitiFact and maybe your institution, for example, or others, to find a way to, both police fake news. I know the Washington Post is doing this. Others, a lot of people are doing this, where they'll go out and they'll quickly say that this has been fake, this is fake, and this is how we can prove it. And also the fire alarm model, where you have, and Facebook has started this, where they're allowing users to basically crowdsource and flag that, as a third party, that something is not verifiable.
Oh, where to even begin? There's a lot of anxiety that coalesces around the emergence of big new technologies, new forms of mass communication, and for every argument in favor of a tech company's responsibility, there's another argument to be made for the responsibility of a user. And that's reflected in our survey work as well. We ask people whose job is it to deal with this issue, the fake news issue specifically, and almost equal shares of the public said it's the government's responsibility on some level, or it's the public's responsibility, or it's the responsibility of companies like Facebook or Google. High shares of the public said that all three, so between 40 and 45%. The implications of that, that would probably, I would think, take a lot of thinking through. What does it mean for a tech company to police this stuff? You were talking about the fact checkers, the role of these partnerships. Well, when that news was announced, plenty of conservative media critics in my Twitter feed were very quick to critique the fact checkers themselves. So this gets complicated. What would it mean for the government to play a role in policing these issues? What are the sort of constitutional issues that come into play there? So that is very complicated. It's also partly why I'm glad that I get to ask the questions, not always come up with the answers.
I just want to say that, while the technology might be new and the ability to proliferate, fake news or lies at the level that we've seen them is new, Trump using the media to do this is not new at all. He's acting the exact same way that he's behaved for the last 30 or so years. If you go back into the 80s and you read magazine profiles of him, you will see an endless stream of lies that were later debunked. You see things like him pretending to be his publicist, pretending to be John Barron or John Miller, and calling up tabloids and giving them salacious material, giving them wild quotes, and they ate it up. During Trump's downfall in the early 90s, there's an article, I think it was in New York Magazine, where they kind of expressed relief at not having to cover this guy who was so available, who was so accessible, who would say and do absolutely anything. And again, this is, there's a healthier media economy, but they liked the traffic, they liked the big sales of the covers. And, Trump has been doing this forever. It's a strategy that goes back, to his days with Roy Cohn, continued throughout the 90s, goes into the reality TV era, and now here he is, 70 years old, and he's got Twitter at his doorstep. He's not, holding press conferences. He can just have little tweets that the news media spends all day obsessing about, looking at the spelling, looking at the grammar, looking for the hidden meanings that he's refusing to relay to the public. And that's it. That's power. That is power. That absolute lack of transparency combined with a tabloid sensibility and a natural instinct on how to manipulate people is power. It's the kind you usually see in a more authoritarian state. So, I think we should be savvy about what Trump's doing. We should look at it from a historical angle. A great person to kind of look into, a great biographer of Trump, is a guy named Wayne Barrett, who revealed all sorts of details about how Trump manipulated the press. And I'm sorry to say that Wayne Barrett is dead. He died tonight, the night before Trump's inauguration. He was basically a walking file of compromise, and he's no longer with us. But which is, very sad. And if anyone who knows him is watching this, my condolences to his family. He was a great writer. And I encourage you to go online and look at what he said, especially recently as Trump was running, because he had a lot of interesting opinions and information that's worth another look.
I think one of the big challenges now is to figure out how to deal with it, which I suspect, Noah, you're going to get to. Because there are so many ways, as Sarah points out, that Trump and his friends are coming at the media, are going around the media, are variously trying to intimidate or ignore the media. And you have, as we know, the media is, and of course that's such a broad term, but newsrooms around the country are always doing some navel-gazing, always fighting the last war, always trying to figure out, well, what went wrong this time, and then they're caught by surprise, by something that happened, something that happens this time, the new time around. Clearly the media missed Trump and who he was and what he stood for and his potential. I think the bigger story that much of the so-called mainstream media missed, on the coast missed, was not just Trump, but actually his voters. That is enduring. And this is something that reporters are trying to puzzle out, even as they try to figure out how to untangle so many different things about Trump and his nominees It's how to understand the country, the context that allowed Trump to be. Obviously, plenty of Republicans, too, didn't see him coming. And that was a mistake. That was a fault. And there's a lot of scrambling going on. A lot of people calling Sarah's number to help figure that out.
That's right. And I actually want to come back to Sarah on that point in a minute. And the question is going to be, how did they miss? And this obviously relates to where the journalists are, where they work. And we've talked about that already. But before we get there, I'd really like us to try to nail down what is the mainstream media. Jesse, I know you have some ideas on how we define this and how consumers define this. I don't know that we have a great handle on what the mainstream media is.
And not only do we not know what it is, it goes to the question of how much trust do you have in the media?
Right.
You might have an idea that the media is WBEZ, and somebody else would have it be Fox News, and somebody else might have it be Breitbart, and yet the question is always the same, and there are only 4 answers.
And I notice, just as another prefatory remark, every time somebody says to me, you won't see this in the mainstream media, I've already seen it in the mainstream media. So there's clearly some differentiation between what I'm considering the mainstream media and what's getting covered by it, and what other people consider the mainstream media and what they think it's covering. Maybe Jesse can solve all of that for me once and for all.
I'll solve it all.
With or without invoking Sarah Palin.
Mainstream, yeah.
Well, it's a harder thing to define, I think, today than it was maybe 15, 20, 25 years ago. I mean, we've seen this bumper crop of digital startups emerge. We didn't have, 20 years ago, we didn't have Breitbart Media. And so everyone is a publisher. Everyone can be a publisher now. We've got citizen voices who come to the mix. Mainstream media, perhaps, if we want to talk about it, we could talk about it in the context of large national established institutional media is one way to think of it. Some of the research in the past has suggested years ago, you might be more likely to have affinity toward or trust toward your own local media outlet than perhaps this idea of the mainstream media. And so certainly if you're asking people questions about what do you think about the media, how do you feel about it, you elicit some pretty negative feedback. Most people feel like the media don't get the facts right. Most people don't have a high degree of trust in the media. Many Americans feel that the media are biased. Now, a lot of people consume what we might call the mainstream media, I suppose, as I've just defined it. It's remarkable the extent to which television still plays a hugely important role in the media diets of Americans in the context of the election or any other time. That goes for cable, local, national TV. It's a bigger source than social media and continues to be so. Nevertheless, the American public tends to be divided. We, as you noted before, live in this polarized and polarizing society. We see that reflected in our media choices as well. On the right, you see conservatives coalescing around Fox News. So it's not necessarily perhaps InfoWars or Breitbart or some of these other digital players who have emerged as notable parts of the drama of the 2016 election. 40%, and we just released this yesterday, 40% of Trump supporters volunteered in a survey that Fox News was their main source of information about the election. There's no analog to that on the left.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. So, Sarah, I said I would follow up with you on how exactly whatever we just called the mainstream media missed Trump voters. Right? So as much as I can say that when people say you won't see this in the mainstream media, I've already seen it. We can also admit that somehow there was a failure to see what the American electorate looked like on the part of a lot of media, not everybody. So how do you think that happened?
I was dumbfounded throughout the entire campaign. I predicted he would win about a year ago. I predicted he'd win the primary, predicted he'd win the general, and I also thought it would be very close. I thought it would be a competitive race between 2 widely disliked candidates, which is what it was. In terms of how they missed it, I think a lot of it has to do with that geographical angle. I'm based in St. Louis. I went to Trump rallies all the time. Went to Pence rallies and Tea Party rallies, and I'd hang out with the voters and talk to them, not as a journalist, but just as a participant in the crowd. And, I wasn't surprised that he caught on with a certain group there because, at first, at least, it had to do with economic concerns. He was hitting, certain points that even resonated with me. They were lies. Like he'd say there's actually 40% unemployment, whereas, technically there's not. But there's maybe, a considerable amount of underemployment and people forced out of the workforce that makes it feel like it's 40% unemployment. And the minute he said that, I felt this feeling of dread because I knew he was going to resonate. And he was also resonating through bigotry, he was resonating through hatred, and he was doing sort of the typical populist, racist demagogue thing. Became increasingly more complex as the campaign went on, as his, financial ties were revealed, his ties to Russia were revealed, all these different angles. But, he had a hold on the electorate. I never quite understood what the polls were saying. They didn't seem to reflect anything I saw. And, he's been a savvy media manipulator all his life. One thing he's done very well that we haven't really discussed is he pretends that the media is his enemy. He's always saying how much he hates the media, especially CNN. Meanwhile, CNN's CEO has a framed Trump tweet on his wall, gives him unprecedented amounts of coverage, has his rallies on all the time. And so, when I saw that, and, I have to add, I have a background studying authoritarian states. I got a PhD studying Uzbekistan. And this was reminding me of the kind of, propaganda that unfortunately you see in places like Uzbekistan or maybe even Turkmenistan, where the president had a golden statue of himself that revolved to face the sun, which is something I can easily imagine on the new White House lawn. And so, all of this was adding up for me. And I was like, this is a really terrible combination of, economic issues, racial issues, media manipulation, conspiracies about Hillary Clinton that have been around for 25 years. Once again, we've got another candidate whose history needs to be viewed in full. These people did not magically emerge in 2016. There was all sorts of baggage, and they each tried to exploit the others. And unfortunately, Trump's team is, extremely shameless and cutthroat, and I think did it a little more effectively. But yeah, I don't know why people thought he wouldn't win. I think sometimes, Americans are famous for being optimistic, for seeing the world through rose-colored glasses. I think it's, hard to see a mushroom cloud through rose-colored glasses. So, get ready to take those glasses off because he's taking office tomorrow. And I hope that, unfortunately, I think we need to take this seriously, take this threat to our democracy seriously. That is what I think it is. And not kid ourselves about what's coming, which is what I think people have been doing for the last year.
So what responsibility, if any, do journalists and do media institutions have for this? Sarah's answer was, and this also makes sense to me, Sarah, that Trump exploited this. Trump surfed this wave. And I want to come back to that too. How do politicians surf this wave? Because we see that going on. Trump may do it better, more obviously than lots of others at a greater scale, but we see others doing it too. But before we get there, how is it that journalists or media institutions bear some responsibility, if any, for not seeing, other than Sarah, who did see, how this might
Sandra
unfold?
of Trumpland, that's an article about me, an actual article.
Maybe Peter, we'll start with you
Well,
and come this way.
I think there's some important things to remember about how who sets the agenda for so much of the coverage nationally. So it is significant that, of course, that the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and USA Today have big readerships, but they're small compared, of course, to the voting public. But stories that appear in those places, in the Washington Post and elsewhere, NPR, are seen and read, heard by people all over the country, in newsrooms across the country. And I think it is safe to say that the agenda setters, and I think editors and producers would admit this themselves, simply didn't get out of the office enough. Mm-hmm. And I think another part of the agenda setting, partly because of polarization, cause and effect, is done by pundits, by the talking heads on television. Now, of course, particularly cable. And they don't get out of the office a lot. They read a lot, They read each other. There's a reason it's called the echo chamber. So that conversation was so insular. And it wasn't that it wasn't find-outable. Some people really did understand what was going on, whether or not they thought Trump could actually beat Clinton. I mean, honestly, very, very few people saw that coming. And one might argue he didn't, after all. She did win by 3 million votes. But there's a certain basic, one of the ways back into the game, and I think most news organizations are recognizing this, is kind of old-fashioned for reporters to be dogged, to be fair, to be accurate, always to be smart, sometimes, though, to zig when others zag, not to follow the pack, and in this climate, never to take it personally. Rebuilding trust in institutions is, by definition, finding credibility, winning credibility, and you're not always going to convince. There are plenty of people you will never convince, whatever your facts and however well understood they are, and you only have to look at climate change as an example of that. But a little bit of stick-to-itiveness and just kind of old-fashioned shoe leather reporting, not getting too worked up over what comes at them and just doing the job.
I want to just pick up on your point about cable agenda setting, the amplification effect that the mainstream media really has. If we want to, not that I want to relitigate per se what happened through the course of this campaign, but one thing that we've been studying coverage of campaigns for many years, and one thing we noticed with the emergence of 24-hour cable news was that in earlier campaigns, perhaps a couple of decades ago, you were more likely to see journalists and television hosts, reporters, helping to tell the story, helping to do that journalism on the air, even if there was a surrogate or a campaign spokesperson or another kind of a talking head, a partisan that was doing their talking head thing. You'd see more challenges by those hosts, by reporters. We started to see a significantly notable, we saw less of that in 2012, where we saw it really flip, where basically what you had at that time was an open platform, more or less, for some of these commentators and guests who get booked to go on these shows to talk. They were getting challenged less. We were talking a little bit about social media, this role of gatekeeper and an agenda setter. And it's arguable that the media, the institutional media, are agenda setters in a way that they can help shape the national conversation. They're not necessarily the gatekeepers that they once were, but they can provide an important amplification effect, perhaps for a tweet. 9% of U.S. adults get news on Twitter. That's it. But I'm willing to bet a lot more have seen a tweet and have seen Donald Trump's tweets in the news cycle or in a notification on their phone or on their television set.
So I'm hearing you say it's not just about amplification, it's about what and how you amplify. And that it's about confrontation and accountability in a two-way conversation. So it's not just Trump's tweets that bypass that. He doesn't hold a press conference, so he doesn't have to ask questions. Instead, he tweets them to bypass that. But that even on cable news, we've set things up so that we're often bypassing that kind of accountability by filling the chairs with pundits, talking heads, partisans, who aren't being held accountable by journalists that have checked their background and checked what they're saying. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, more or less, what I'm really trying to say is that the norms of perhaps broadcast or mainstream journalism were such that entering into this period with a candidate like Trump, there was an environment that wasn't always sort of ready to do that kind of journalistic work. If you're looking at the sort of the broad trajectory of what you see in American political coverage as we've studied over the past few decades. So the extent to which American journalists are regrouping, trying to figure out how to cover this presidency, one of the things I have to grapple with is this tradition of journalistic norms and whether those norms are really in every way appropriate to this administration. Perhaps, as you say, journalists are thinking about how to resurrect time-honored norms of journalism. I don't know. It'll be very interesting to observe.
I think there's become a desire, on this question of the echo chamber, which I completely agree with. There's this desire now to not surround yourself with people with whom you disagree, to not read or see anything that you might disagree with. And if you do see it, the commentary or the language coming out of it is just completely vitriolic. And so between that, and sometimes you do see that on cable TV, for example, or where people will be surrounded by just those with whom they agree, or they're just not pressed on fact checking. You saw it in particular in social media, this question of the echo chamber. I know myself, my personal anecdote, and when I was asked to comment publicly on whom I thought would win, which candidate would win, I always kept saying, you never know, you never know, you never know. And that's only that's not because of the news, it's because of my personal experience with campaigns. I campaigned for Bloomberg as mayor, and nobody saw that coming. And then he won. And so that's what I used to tell people, you never know. But deep down, because I would see my feed on Facebook or Twitter or wherever, and because I would read, the same print outlets and the same ex-government officials or columnists who all seemed to argue against Donald Trump, I remember deep down thinking, okay, but there's really no way, right? I mean, look at who's out there saying all this. And it just felt like I was in this bubble, and I knew this bubble existed. I mean, for my own work, I know this bubble exists. And it's almost as though the Hillary supporters and the Trump supporters were two ships sailing in the night. And Wall Street Journal at some point, I can't remember whether it was before or after the election, did a side-by-side on Facebook feeds of those who supported each candidate and how radically different they looked. And I have to be honest with you, I think it would be great if the tech world could figure out a way where that wasn't the case. I'm not sure they're going to take that responsibility on because I don't know if that really increases profits for them. But I do think that that's quite dangerous, this echo chamber, because it's like we're walking with blinders on. And it makes you question what we could predict or even what we know about our fellow citizens and what they want and what they like in a candidate.
Well, I can sense we're going to have a vigorous Q&A time, and we're getting to that point. So I'm going to ask my last question, but I know folks out there are ready to ask theirs. My last question, though, is we have almost 300 people here tonight, and we've talked a little bit about what social media companies and tech companies are doing, can do. We've talked a little bit about how media institutions and journalists have contributed to the problem and what they might do to address it. What can we do as individuals? When we walk out of this room, what is, from each of you, one takeaway for the folks in this room that we can do to address these challenges? Maybe we'll start on this side and move toward Peter this time.
I think it's the same it's the same responsibility that a columnist has, that a reporter has, that any journalist has. I think public citizens have and American citizens have. This question of users of social media, now calling out when something seems fake or something is just completely contrived or completely fabricated. We have to, in order to restore trust in our media and trust also in the government, we haven't really touched on the question of the government, and it's an awkward, there's a lot I think the government can and should do. It's just awkward with the next administration and their priorities, maybe, to put it diplomatically. But that being said, I think that there's this cycle, right, where the public doesn't trust the media or maybe the government, and it just fuels this fake news cycle. And so, anyway, I think that citizens do have a responsibility to, when they read something, one, if they think it's fake, do some more researching. right? Like, is this person quoting a real person? This event seems a bit weird. Did it actually happen? So there's the question of additional research, which is a lot more legwork on the part of, just the regular citizen. If it does seem fake, maybe calling it out whether it's maybe an easy click on Facebook, or whether, the beauty of the social medias or the Huffington Post or whatever is maybe somebody, a regular citizen, wants to write something and say, this was stated and it's totally wrong and this is how I know. And so just being more involved, participating more. One of the things, and I'll end this because I know, you want to get to everybody, that I thought, before coming on, one of the things that I did simply was Google fake news and journalism. That was actually I Googled definition of journalism, even though we all know what it is, right? To examine and assess facts and present a story, or present the news. But I stumbled on the page of the International Press Institute, I believe, and there was a sentence there that said, democracies generally have a greater presentation of news and information, more news and information out there. And what's really terrifying is that the fake news and the post-truth undermines our democracy, and I think you said that, Sarah. So we all as citizens, in an effort to uphold our democracy, have an obligation to get more involved.
Good, thank you.
Well, I'm not really in the advice-giving business, but I suppose what I will offer is maybe it's a cautionary note. Based on some of the things I've seen in our research, we did this report asking the public about this fake news issue. We found that 64% of U.S. adults said that they thought that fake news was causing confusion over the basic facts. So an indication that there's some anxiety about that. We asked them how they thought, whether they could sort out, fact from fiction, and upwards of 80%, past 80%, expressed some degree of confidence that they could navigate this hall of mirrors on the internet. And this echoes something we've seen with other research. Robots are coming for our jobs, but they won't take mine. How do we, as the public, feel about our own confidence in sorting through this maze of information versus how we project upon the general public? Perhaps we're more likely to think we can sort this out pretty easily on our own than we feel the general public can. I don't know. It's just it's a set of findings that's kind of stuck with me, and so I leave you with that as you go forth and re-enter the Hall of Mirrors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're dealing with a lot of problems. This has been displayed throughout this panel. I think we're going to be dealing with some new ones. I guess my advice is to not let the new conditions of the incoming administration stifle your curiosity, stifle your holding both journalists and the government to task. I think we're right that when you read a story, you should, if you're interested in that topic, read another story, research the quotes, make sure that they're real. Look for as much as you can, and if you find something, share it. We don't have a monopoly on that. I do think that the First Amendment is in for a beating over the next year or 4 or however we have left. I think it's important. Sorry, I know I'm freaking you out, but that's because I am. I think it's important, that we do not take that right for granted, that we don't take any of our rights for granted right now, and that when we see it being threatened, that we stand up for it. That we stand up for journalists, even if you might not like the journalist in question. I think what happened at Trump's press conference is a good example of that. Doesn't matter how you feel about Jim Acosta, that was wrong. And so I think that, we need to have the press as a check on government. That's traditionally been its purpose, is to be able to expose and critique the government. We still have that right, no matter what anybody tells you. It is in the Constitution. And so I think that we need to, if we're journalists, we need to uphold it. If we're citizens, you need to stand up for it because it benefits the public to have have that right too. No one should have their speech taken away, no matter who they are.
I vote for that. I think that's exactly right. Standing up for the media, which is going to be tough at times. I think I would look, just to add to these great ideas, I would say find the work of reporters you admire and respect and share it. Share it on social media. Share it with your friends. Talk it up. I would say it is, let their organizations know that this work is valuable. How can you do that? Well, you could subscribe to a newspaper or a magazine or something online because it isn't free to do this work. And the harder the investigation, the longer and more complex, the more lawyers are required to protect against trouble, the more expensive it is. And one of the challenges faced by the Sun-Times and the Tribune, as we all know, is the staff is shrinking and the news hole is shrinking, and that costs money. So subscribe. If it's a nonprofit, consider donating. If it's public radio or public television or any of the many nonprofit news organizations, you've probably seen that ProPublica is coming to Chicago. There are other smaller investigative groups. And then another thing I would do, taking the idea, as Sarah suggested, that we need to be in it for the long haul. Talk to young people about news and the value of news and the value of truth and honesty and being fair, and have them recognize many of the things that my colleagues up here have said about why the free press is essential. Because it is, whatever happens in the next 4 years, we got a long way to go. And if young people are on board and recognizing it and fighting for it, that will help everybody.
Well, those are some terrific answers, pointing even to some virtues and values and passing those on. Even the virtue of humility, Jesse pointed out. We like to think that everybody else struggles with this and that we don't, and we ought to test ourselves and increase our abilities to discern fake news, and then also support good news. I loved how we ended on that note of not just knowing what might be fake or understanding how we might be manipulated in a post-truth or post-fact environment, but really supporting good news. So thank you for that, all four of you. All right, we have time for questions and answers, and lots of hands. This is fantastic. I'll start right here in the front row.
Forgive me, but I think you are preaching to the choir here. I would be willing to bet a substantial sum that the number of people in this room who rely on social media for their news approaches zero. Approaches zero. Did you notice that I did fudge it? But approaches zero. And I understand that one of the ways you judge the truth of something on social media, if it's Facebook, you want to know how many likes it gets, and if it's Twitter, you want to know how many times it's been retweeted. If you start with if you know that some of your audience has perhaps a conspiracy theory that the mainstream media, it's all lies, you can't believe it. How do you approach this? You have a room full of people who have come to learn more. Not everybody does that. How do you approach this? How do you deal with someone who drives all the way from North Carolina with an AK-47 to self-investigate the story that Hillary Clinton was running a sex ring out of a pizza parlor? Who believes that? How do they come to believe that? And what do you do? What can you do in that environment?
This is a great question. Let me rephrase it. As I heard the question, it was almost, aren't we a sort of echo chamber? Aren't we preaching to the choir? And is there a way that you can overcome that? How do you do better than just preach to the choir on this issue?
I mean, I think this sort of goes back to what I was saying before about local news organizations. I think most people either know a lot of journalists or they don't know any journalist. You know, there's whole towns and regions where there's nobody there anymore covering them. Those are sometimes the regions where you get people who read wild conspiracies online and, you know, do things like drive to a DC pizza parlor. I think when people realize that, you know, journalists are, you know, well, regular, I wouldn't say we're normal human beings, but, you know, we're fellow citizens of this country. There shouldn't be this divide between the reader and the journalist. And when there's people you know, you see their faces, you see them walking around, I think there's less of an impulse to sort of view, quote, the mainstream media as this massive, you know, corrosive force that has some sort of sway, you know, over the populace of the United States that only InfoWars or something can break. So I think, again, if you build things up on a small level and you give people, you know, if someone thinks there's an important story in their region and their concerns are not being heard, their voice is not being heard, they have a person they can go to. And that person won't be Breitbart or Alex Jones or somebody who might exploit that kind of anxiety that individual has, which is something you see all the time now. I think that's a potential antidote. I mean, it's a long-term structural problem, so it's not going to change overnight, but I think it's worth investing in.
Any other answers to that question?
Well, I think in addition, there's only so much journalists can do. There have been crazy people driving to check out weird rumors and carrying guns and setting off bombs for a really long time. And so the work of journalism is to expose and explain and amplify, to share voices, to tell stories, to as broad an audience as we can reach. Now, part of that question implies, how do you reach more people with the stories that you think are important? And that is something we are seeing in this remarkable and I think very positive democratization of the news media. How many people in this room listen to podcasts, you know, once a week? And it's more and more and more. And how many people happen to like StoryCorps on NPR because it's a little 2-minute splice of something that connects in This American Life? And the same kinds of things are happening with YouTube videos, and they're happening with mini documentaries and so forth. And the challenge is to do not just stories that are fair and accurate and earnest and make people, you know, eat their spinach and suddenly become Democrats, which, you know, is probably what a lot of people would like to happen who have lost this election. But what it is, beyond that, it is to do engaging journalism that attracts people, that teaches them stuff. And over time, one imagines that that can have an influence of various kinds. But there are always going to be people who say, well, it's not true because it's their ox that's being gored. There's only so much we can do, but we can keep pushing forward. And I see, as I was saying before, I just see an awful lot of journalists who are professional journalists or aspiring journalists or kind of part-time journalists who are thinking in remarkably creative and principled ways going forward.
As soon as we had a chance, we had a lot of hands go up. I'm going to come to this side of the room right here toward the front.
I'm a pretty old guy. I remember Walter Cronkite. And I remember the time when there was something really wrong with this country, you could depend on mainstream media to basically say, no, this is wrong. And what I see now is a media that's scared, mainstream media, to speak truth to power. So what, after the election happened, I naturally started to look at how did Trump win? And I started discovering that there were Russians all over his campaign. Paul Manafort, Carter Page running back and forth. And it became so obvious to me that I never found any question of this in mainstream media. So I looked on Twitter, and the first person I found was Sarah. And I get all my news on Twitter now because Sarah tells me who to follow.
Way to go.
And I am incensed. I follow people like Kurt Eichenwald, David Korn, Summer Brennan, all those people.
So we've got a lot of hands. We'll have to get to a question.
Okay. So my question is, I really feel that we're in this mess because nobody in the mainstream media was willing to speak truth to power. They wanted to maximize their audience, so they wouldn't say anything about the Russian takeover. The dossier has to be proven. We're not really going to talk about that. For example, mainstream media, I'm no longer reading the Chicago Tribune because the day after the dossier was revealed, the next day, the first story, the only story on the Trump-Russia connection was on page 6. So my question is, in this environment, when we didn't have mainstream media step up, how do you think it's going to improve when now the government is controlled by an authoritarian? I am very worried. So that's a big question.
So I hear the question this way. There may be a role that fear played in setting up the media. Fear of losing status, fear of losing followers, fear of losing market share, whatever it was. And it may have been going on for a long time before the campaign season began. And if that's true, if there was a role for fear, and that might get worse, given some of the things that, for example, Sarah has put on the table during this discussion, how do we deal with that? How should journalists and media institutions deal with the pervasive fear of losing market share, not to mention other things that may be worse in the wake of changes to how we see, say, the First Amendment?
I think the fear is a hell of a lot more than market share right now. I think that that's what happened in the beginning. I think that's something that Trump was able to exploit, was the fact that the media economically was fairly bottomed out, that he was an instant person to give ratings, clicks, cash, whatever. What you're seeing now, you know, a story about Trump in a Moscow hotel with a couple of prostitutes, that's a story that will get you ratings, that will get you clicks. And you're seeing hesitancy to report on this, even though this was a leaked dossier, even though David Corn reported on this way back in October. You know, these are the stories that got buried. On November 5th, the New York Times public editor wrote a whole thing about how the Russian influence story was the biggest story of the year, and the Times had blown it. And they're still continuing to blow it. And I think one of the reasons is that, you know, one, it's a difficult story to report on. You need to know about espionage, Russian and U.S. You need to know about foreign corruption. You need to understand Russian culture. You need to understand U.S. politics. And you need to know the whole biography of Trump, which is just like a minefield. And while you're doing this, while you're looking into all this, there's a lot of people that do not want this information out. And they've made that abundantly clear in multiple threats to journalists. And so, you know, you have an economic problem. People worry about their careers, which I think is short-sighted. But there's, you know, people are also worried about their lives. They're worried about their safety. And I don't see that getting addressed in a forthright way by a lot of journalistic institutions. And I kind of wish, you know, we would just let that out. I guess I'm doing it now. And talk about this, because it's just going to get worse under this administration. And I think that, you know, it's important that we continue to tackle this issue, because as everyone has admitted, it's a big one that was undercovered, you know, for the safety of our democracy, because it's an issue of sovereignty, of national security. Those are not minor things. This is, you know, many have said it's bigger than Watergate. I agree. So I think we need to keep pursuing it and, you know, support those who keep pursuing it.
I have a slightly different take on what reporters are up to now. There's no question but that the media was slow on a lot of fronts. But let's take the Russia example. I think there's certain reasons that news organizations did not publish the dossier because they couldn't prove what was in it. And remember how we've been talking about credibility and wanting to make sure we know what we're talking about, and reporters want to print what is accurate, because that is what counts. I think an awful lot of reporters, I know an awful lot of reporters are going after that, have been going after that, and will continue to dig really, really deeply. And I think, and we'll see, right? We'll see. But I think Mr. Trump may learn the hard way that the easiest way to get people, investigative reporters, to go after you is to say you can't have something. Right? It works backwards. Like if he sweet talked everybody and said, look, everything's fine, come on in, look at my files, everything's great. Reporters' guard might be down a little bit and go, oh, okay, I get it. And he is doing exactly the opposite. And there's blood in the water. I think it is entirely likely that these investigations will continue and they will go deeper and deeper. Reporters love that. People, I mean, however you see the politics of big-time reporters, an awful lot of them got into this business to speak truth to power and are not afraid. And I really don't think that it was fear that was stopping the vast majority of reporters or getting in their way this time. I really don't.
Actually, we do have to move on. We have so many hands up. In the back, in the pink sweater.
You talked about concerns for First Amendment rights. Can we key into the libel and slander laws? Trump has threatened to tighten them to make it easier to sue reporters. How does that affect both the mainstream media and also some of the side players in terms of these pop-up sites and bloggers?
I'll take it if no one else wants it, but I don't want to dominate.
The only thing I'll say is that it's expensive to prepare for these kinds of threats, of potential assaults, lawsuits, and this is where you really, I think, see the power of a journalistic institution in its at least potential to insulate, to protect, to lawyer up. It just brings us back to, again, this is the sort of thing that the economic crisis in journalism, this is the sort of impact that it can potentially have. I know you were going to say something.
I just want to say that that's a really great question. I think it's something that the panel could have discussed. I think we've had a precursor to this situation with what happened to Gawker when it was sued out of existence by Peter Thiel. And, they had a case. I think what Gawker did was wrong, but I don't think that that's the reason that they went after Gawker. And so I would expect, given Trump's long history of, litigious action and also just threatening lawsuits against people in order to silence them, he often doesn't follow through all the way, that we're going to see a lot of that, especially because he has been completely unwilling to divest his personal life, his businesses, from the office of the presidency. And I expect him to use these same kind of abusive tactics to try to control the press in the future. So that's something, we should all be looking out for that.
Did you have something on that, Hagar?
No, I worry a little less about it because a lot of it is talk. And that's what the point I was trying to make with the fake news in tabloids. That this type of activity has existed for a long time. It just didn't exist in the political world, or as much at least. And for the tabloids, the celebrities, for example, they'll pick and choose what they, if something is so egregious or actively creates damage to their reputation, to their profits, to their business, whatever, that's when you'll see them take action. But otherwise, they don't, because it's expensive, it's arduous, it would take up a lot of time. So I think you'll see, I think there are, I don't want to, because I am also concerned about, the president-elect's threats to sue constantly, because I actually do think he'll take action on that. But I don't know that he'll succeed, frankly, because the laws should be quite clear. And I think there's only so far he can go. I would hope that things are, fake news, for example, is defined quite clearly as, outright fabrications. But for example, and I keep coming back to this because I'm so shocked by the story that came out today that we were talking about earlier of this 23-year-old, I don't know if you all saw this 23-year-old guy who started this website and just started fabricating news, mainly just for money, not even for a political agenda, though he himself, I believe, was Republican. Yes, to pay off college loans. And it was working, and I'm pretty certain he's going to get a lawsuit on his hands, now, especially now that he became so public. Because some of those stories he created, one of them, for example, went to 6 million viewers. And that's not enough to sway an election, but that is a lot of viewers and a lot to sway. And so my point is, to sum it up, is just, I am concerned, but not to that extent, because I think just like the celebrities, people will pick and choose. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it is a concern, but it's not the biggest concern I have. I'm much more concerned with the public distrusting the media and not trusting the government. Even this government sometimes can't admit failure. A government that admits failure, a media source that admits failure, we'll gain the trust of the public quite easily.
Good. Now we have time for one more question, but I have the job of discerning which is the shortest question in the room because we're almost to the end. So if you have a very short question, keep your hand up. I'll come right here in the corner.
So what I'm wondering is, I don't think facts will matter, breaking the facts out. People believe the facts that they want. They pick the facts that go with their emotional setup. And Jonathan Haidt and other researchers have shown that. So how can news that spreads facts possibly counter people that are just deciding based on their gut feelings anyway? And what's the response to that?
Well, that's quite the ending question. If one of you or two of you have comments on that, we can end on that note.
It may not really help things, but the American public say they want facts. So I leave it to you to discern the extent to which the public knows what it's talking about, or is willing to engage with facts that counter their predispositions. But there is perhaps a primal kind of desire among the public for factual information. It's there, even if we tend to sometimes disagree on what the facts are, even if we're, all of us, at various times, unwilling to really engage with facts that burst our bubble. There is a kind of bedrock, and if you in any way trust the American public as a whole, if you're a journalist, if you're someone who wants to see civic life rich and nurtured with, upon a bedrock of factual information, a democratic society that works with facts, that's something to not entirely dismiss or ignore.
I think it's significant. Just one final thing. I think exactly so. There's significant evidence that lots of facts over a long period of time will change people's minds. I think we shouldn't. I don't think we should necessarily say the sky is falling because of this one particular episode. Not least because we adapt. The world of journalism adapts. The world of politics adapts, and facts do matter.
And I'll just say, the Haidt example is a very good one. Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, great example. And he gives us clues. We don't have time to explore them tonight because we're at the end of our program, but he gives us clues about how to do that we could couple with a lot of these responses. And if there weren't any clues about how to do it, his own book would be a performative contradiction in that he's out to change people's minds, to give them some new facts. And so hopefully we together can accomplish those same kinds of things. So this concludes tonight's program. Thank you all for coming.